Alright YouTube, here's an article that I think people will find pretty interesting. As usual, the link is in the description. It's on Russia Today. Of course, the mainstream Western media has a problem with articles involving science and real events of interest because it all revolves around Lady Gaga's new dress or why Miley Cyrus butched her hair off or things like that. But it's entitled Fukushima Apocalypse, Years of Duct Tape Fixes could result in millions of deaths. Um, Apparently, the Fukushima plant, of course, it was a plant in Japan that got damaged and released a great deal of radiation already into the Pacific Ocean, a rather severe amount of radiation. It's having more problems. The land beneath the power plant, the core, is sinking. And the problem with this is that it still contains a large number of spent and active fuel rods because of the reasons why it had problems in the first place. There's a great deal of nuclear fuel there. Nuclear fuel, if you know anything about how nuclear reactions work, involves this principle. It's called critical mass. Critical mass is when you get enough of the material into a small enough space that it undergoes a massive chain reaction and continues to essentially ignite, releasing radioactive material, releasing energy. Now, the first nuclear bombs that we used, the first atomic bombs, did this simply by taking an explosive shell around a sphere of uranium and making sure it blew up all around at the same time, compressing a core that's not quite at critical mass into a smaller area, thus achieving critical mass. The mass was increased as to the volume it contained. The other way that it's done, like in a nuclear plant, is you take the fuel rod and you put it into another casing which contains nuclear material, and neither part is at critical mass until you put them together. Then it hits critical mass and starts giving off energy. The idea is to slow down the process in a nuclear power plant so that it's releasing the energy, the radiation, but it's not actually blowing up. It's not like an actual atomic bomb. The problem is these fuel rods are in an uneven footing right now in this large aquatic environment, slowly leaking into the ocean and moving around. Now, the problem is if these fuel rods come into contact with each other in the right way, you could have an out-of-control chain reaction, which could cause an explosion, which could cause a very long-timed release of nuclear material. And as this article points out, this would be a problem for more than Japan. They're talking about also the fuel, the nuclear contamination, is moving closer to the Tokyo aquifer. That's the aquifer that over 10 million people get water from. Japan is an island country, which means that its aquifers are few and far between, because there isn't that large an area that's not near a coastline. So where they're getting their water from, if that gets contaminated, they're fucked. They would either risk cancer and birth defects, or turn into ghouls or whatever, sort of Fallout 3 style, or they'd have to evacuate. Let me go through some of this stuff here, some of the things that are said, and I'll point out an additional funny instance as well. If and when the corium reaches the Tokyo aquifer, serious and expedient discussions will have to take place about evacuating 40 million people. Of course, Tokyo is the largest city on Earth by population. Now, I don't think by land area, but by population, it's enormous. It's very heavily concentrated. Most of their water comes from within this aquifer. It doesn't come from a river. It doesn't come from desalination, although even if you were doing desalination, all of the coastal waters of Japan on that side are now contaminated too. So what would you do? Now, the problem is this. This is what they're suggesting. They're going to try to extract these fuel rods to move them to a safer area. Essentially, they're trying to get rid of, they can't just cover it up. It's too close to the ocean. It's too close to the aquifer. They can't leave it there. They've got to get rid of this nuclear fuel somehow. What they're suggesting is to lift these fuel rods out manually. They're not even going to use a computerized system to do it because they can't. The area is too uneven, there's too much damage, it's too close to the coast, and it's in flux. The area of this power plant is literally moving day by day. The contamination is moving, the fuel rods are moving. What's the problem? If one of these crane operators, these are going to have to be real people removing these rods, makes an error, drops a fuel rod, nudges another fuel rod with it, it would start releasing massive amounts of radiation. It would kill the crane operator most likely, and these people are going to have to wear lead vests, lead suits anyway, just to even get near the reactor. They're going to have to come in with cranes and manually lift these fuel rods out. If one of them falls and hits another fuel rod the right way, you could have a nuclear explosion. A massive, massive nuclear explosion. You could have a chain reaction event where one of the fuel rods starts going off because it hits another fuel rod, and then the ones around it start going off, and because they're, underwater, it may not cause an actual nuclear explosion so much as it will simply go into hyperdrive, and nothing they do will stop the event, and then you'll have radiation spewing out of it for, weeks or months, or I don't know how long the burn would continue. It might continue for years, blanketing most of the world in at least some radioactivity. That would be very, very bad for the Earth. Just think of Chernobyl. Chernobyl contained ostensibly a lower amount of nuclear fuel. And of course, it wasn't in an aquatic. Japan is an island. Chernobyl was inland Ukraine, and the direction of the air moving the majority of this fallout ash just carried it over land. It didn't carry it into any major aquifers. It didn't carry it into any major rivers. It just sort of blanketed this rather large area of rural farmland. What happened? Areas near Chernobyl still have problems with people have cancer, they have a high rate of birth defects, they have a high rate of nutritional problems because their bodies get fucked up from radiation. You look at some of the trees in the fallout zone of Chernobyl, they're mutated too. They have mutated animals. There are dead zones where basically nothing lives. And this is in an area where most of the fallout fell over land, didn't get into any major aquifers, and didn't get into any major water systems carrying it to the ocean. Can you imagine this volume of nuclear material going into the Pacific Ocean? Japan would be completely fucked. Most areas in Japan would no longer be habitable. Tokyo would be gone. The largest city on Earth would be depopulated. It wouldn't be habitable anymore, or at least for a great deal of time. And you can read the comments, and some of these people are flipping out. Now, of course, there's a lot of skepticism towards anything that doesn't appear in what people call the mainstream media. I would ask them this. When's the last time you honestly thought it was a good idea to trust the mainstream media with such a story? They usually don't even report on such things. Science gets pushed to page 2 most of the time because it's not as exciting to people as, oh, Obama seen wearing a sports bra while hanging out on the beach. Was he mocking feminism? George Bush's new haircut, things like that. But this is something that could affect hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people. Imagine the way the jet stream carries air from Japan. And you can look at maps of the fallout that's already gone into the Pacific Ocean. Imagine that fallout increases. I would encourage people to study Bikini Atoll. Bikini Atoll was a little island area. It's basically a crescent-shaped island that was used for a nuclear test back, I believe, in the 1950s. Until very recently, the entire area was a dead zone because of nuclear fallout. The difference is when you detonate a nuclear bomb, most of the radiation is used up as energy. It's a relatively clean burn. There is fallout. It does remain in the area, but it is a relatively clean burn of the nuclear material. Most of it gets expended. Actually, I can't remember whether it's beryllium or some other atom that's actually formed during the process. It releases other elements, energy, of course, electrons, and then it releases clumps of, partially detonated material that are still radioactive, which cause the actual fallout, and not the sort of sunburn that you get if you are too close to a nuclear explosion, but literally particles of unexploded uranium or whatever. The problem with this being that it would release mainly undetonated material, rather large particles of it as well, into the Pacific Ocean, into the atmosphere, which would probably hit the United States. It would probably hit Canada and Mexico. It would hit South America. It may go further than that. Depending on which way the wind's going, it could hit anywhere. So you've got a potential fallout event which affects hundreds of millions or billions of people. Now, other people in the forum where I saw this story first, because I don't go to Russia Today on a regular basis. I go to it more often than most news sources, but still. People were trying to say, oh, well, it's not going to release that much radiation. Japan will be, completely destroyed, but it's not really going to affect us because, and then insert reason here. The problem being none of these people have, experience with nuclear physics or anything like that, any more than I do. So it's all conjecture. What happens if 1,300 fuel rods all start detonating and releasing clouds of, radioactive ash into the sky? It's radioactive matter leaches into the Pacific Ocean. It would certainly hit the Tokyo aquifer. You couldn't decontaminate it all. It'd be far too radioactive for far too long. There'd be too much of a volume of it. You're looking at the death of most coastal sea life in the region. You're looking at buildup of radioactive elements in fish all throughout the Pacific Ocean. Guess what? Where do you think your seafood comes from? It comes from the ocean. Right now, for instance, you're not supposed to eat too much seafood because you can get mercury poisoning over time. You can degrade your neurological functions because there's too much mercury. Well, what happens if instead of mercury poisoning that we're worrying about, we start worrying about, oh, if you eat too many fish, you're gonna get cancer. Your face is going to peel off. You're gonna start getting blisters on your genitals, and your ball sack will swell to the size of a ripe cantaloupe. These are the problems you might have to deal with if something like this happens. And they're talking about basically duct tape fixes. Yes. They've been trying to do things to contain this radioactivity at Fukushima, and it doesn't really matter how well they contain the low level of leaching that's going on right now, because if these fuel rods move the right way, all of it's going to go into the atmosphere and into the water. That would be a major event. That would be far worse than Chernobyl, which again was inland. It only affected areas where it happened to fall. If it falls into the ocean, it's different. It gets spread around. You're looking at the death of fisheries. You're looking at the death of certain species of fish in that area that'll start getting all sorts of mutations and birth defects, sterility. All of these effects that come from radiation poisoning could potentially hit these species. You're looking at some perhaps endangered species going extinct. So why wouldn't the environmentalists be all on board with trying to fix this as quickly as possible? What they should do, if this story is presumably accurate and isn't just being alarmist, which it doesn't sound like it's being alarmist, it sounds very, very likely to be true, they need to get the top scientists that know about these things to Fukushima very quickly and try to figure out some way to keep it from going, wrong, because then, again, one Japanese crane worker farts while he's lifting out a fuel rod, drops it from the crane, or it bumps another fuel rod, he gets blasted with a dose of radiation that makes his skin sizzle and turn into sausage, and then most of Japan is depopulated and everyone starts getting cancer, and we literally end up with Japan being Fallout 3. Can you imagine Tokyo, what it would look like abandoned? You think Detroit's bad. There are actually people living in Detroit. And most of them don't have horrible mutations. And Detroit's smaller in size, not necessarily in size, but it's smaller in population than Tokyo. Can you imagine Tokyo, the gem of Japan, the biggest city in the world, depopulated? It'd be pretty devastating to the people of Japan. It would be pretty devastating to people on the west coast of the United States who would start drinking radioactive water. It might even hit here. I'm not sure exactly how far it would travel, whether most of it would go into the ocean or some of it would hit the mainland of the Americas. It's entirely possible. And again, the smaller amount of radiation released at Chernobyl was sufficient so that people are still suffering from cancer and birth defects, not people exposed to the initial fallout, people that just live there and eat the food now. Ukraine and that section of Russia and parts of Europe that were affected still have a very high rate of birth defects, relatively speaking, because the soil is contaminated with large doses of radiation. When you eat the food, your vegetables start absorbing those radioactive particles. It may not affect the vegetables, but you're eating a lot more vegetables than the vegetable is eating of radioactive particles. It builds up. This is how DDT worked in the eagle population. It didn't affect some of the smaller birds. They were just eating seeds or nuts or whatever because the dosage they were consuming was smaller. The eagle's consuming those small birds. It's getting a much higher dosage. We're up near the top of the food chain. Some shrimp that's crawling around on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean is probably not going to have any negative effects from that level of fallout. The things eating the shrimp may not have much of an effect from fallout, but the people that are eating the fish that are eating the shrimp probably will. So again, it could be an apocalyptic issue if something does go wrong and this is true, where people start having, third arms and, one eye in the middle of their forehead. It would be devastating for the gene pool of the planet. The level of fallout that you can't possibly just decontaminate with chemical compounds. That's about all. Peace out.